Good evening. Welcome to Street Talk. So I'm here. I have a wonderful guest with me tonight. I do want to take 2 seconds out of the show and briefly send our prayers and our thoughts down to really the community down in Florida. And more than our thoughts and our prayers, I'm going to say we need to talk about this. And I know I had a different thing in mind for the show at the very beginning of this. I know Father Russ came to me in a dream last night, and he told me some of the stuff that I need to talk about. So obviously, I'm getting my direct messages from him. So the second half of the show, I do want to come back around and talk to this. Today, I have a wonderful guest. He's running for the Senate 17th, and which encompasses much of our territory that we have on TV here. And I met him a little over a week and a half ago. I know I have an instantaneous connection because he's good friends with Brad and Justin from over in Hamden. Sean Grace.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you on here. You're hanging out with my buddy J5 and
Yes.
Brad McDowell. I saw Brad yesterday, actually.
Oh, great.
He's going to be helping with one of the campaigns that I'm involved with. So I know you have good people up in Hamden.
It's like Kim Rose. Yeah.
No,
great.
not Kim Rose. Ellen Beatty.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Yeah.
So I know you have good people in Hamden, and there's a lot of strong support over there. And I have to ask the magical question.
Yeah.
You're running for the 717th.
Yes.
How come? Why are you running?
Yeah. So back in 2016, when we lost the seat, and actually 5 out of the 7 towns in the district, so it's Naugatuck, Beacon Falls, Ansonia, Derby, Bethany, Woodbridge, and Hamden. 5 of the 7 towns voted for Trump. And I think there were a lot of reasons for that. But on a state level, the way I view it is that Democrats have kind of gotten away from their traditional base of support. Blue-collar workers, which account for, which I am one, and account for a great deal of the 17th district. So I think that the only way we're going to start winning again, and really Connecticut on the state level has become a purple state. You know, the state senate is tied 18-18, and that's why this was such a frustrating legislative season in 2017, and it might be again this year because there's basically gridlock forming. No one can get anything done, and I think that it's going to remain that way until we have a conversation directly with voters again, right at their doors, all thousands of them in the district. There's maybe 30,000 homes in the district, and I intend to knock on every one of those doors and have conversations with them one-on-one and find out what they need from Hartford. I think if you go back to the recession, Connecticut's response, because of a lot of the issues with our kind of irresponsible handling of pension liabilities, going back quite a long ways, in which both parties had a part in, our response was to cut and have these austerity budgets, which essentially means that because of these mistakes going back a generation, we're putting that responsibility on the next generation, because these cuts are not free, right? They're not simply let's make things more efficient. They're actually cutting into services. And one thing was clear after these past budget negotiations and all is the interrelationship between local budgets and the state budget. There's just no getting around it. That if anyone wasn't aware of how interrelated they were and how interdependent they are now. So towns are scrambling, trying to figure out how to make up shortfalls from state aid for education and other aid. The town I live in now, Hamden, has furlough days for teachers. Other towns are trying to find cuts that they can make. But these cuts, again, these are on the backs of our children.
As they say, there's no free lunch, and all the low-hanging fruit has been cut down to this point. And I know one of the difficulties that we face as a state. Number one, I think a lot of our industry changed when we went into the last recession. I also think on the back end of this is usually when you go into a recession, they're called like V recessions. So they go like straight down, and they usually like kind of like pop straight up to a certain degree. We kind of went down, went up a little bit, and have been kind of like running along this course like over here. So the reality is, while everybody says, you know, it's all about cutting spending, the revenue never really popped back up, and it's probably about flat level to where we were maybe about 8 years ago, and hasn't really grown since. And I think that's a major issue. And everybody keeps saying, well, we got to cut. Well, now you're down to the bone, and you're like, well, these are like difficult choices that you're going to be able to have to ask people to make.
That's right. You know, in many cases, you know, for education in particular, we have this over-reliance on property taxes, on local property taxes, which, when you look at it from a state level, doesn't tend to be equitable. So when cuts are made to that, and then you have communities having this choice of raising mill rates or cutting budgets, communities that are struggling end up leaning towards cutting budgets on exactly the population of students that that educational dollars should not be cut from. So we're going to create this disparity in the state that will have, I think, a long-term effect, negative effect. So I do think we need to look at revenue, and the question is, where does it come from? There's a lot of talk about tolls, and there's a lot of good reasons to look at tolls. For one thing is, you know, anyone who drives out of state right now, they are paying tolls. You go to New York, you go to Massachusetts, you're paying tolls. We have a ton of, something like 40%, I believe, of, or somewhere around there, of, if you look on like 95, the drivers are coming from out of state. So that's a lot of potential revenue coming from out of state that we could get. And with modern, you know, some of the objections, whenever you talk about tolls, you have to make clear that you're not talking about the tolls that we used to have in Connecticut a long time ago. You're talking about purely electronic tolls like they have on the Mass Pike, where you just drive under it, and if you weren't looking up, you won't even know you passed it. But one of the good things about having purely electronic system is you get to tinker around a bit, and you could find ways to kind of reduce the effect on local taxpayers in Connecticut. So you could have potentially, I've heard a number of proposals, but one is, say, a monthly allowance for Connecticut drivers, or a tax rebate, things like that, to reduce the, you know, because inherently tolls are going to affect lower income folks more than so we do have to look at that, and I'm of the view that any revenue that we get as a whole, you could have tolls, but if you have some other revenue sources that in balance, it needs to be equitable, needs to be fair. If you look at the way, I think some will focus strictly on income tax rates, and so it looks like we have this very progressive tax structure in Connecticut. But as we were just talking about how interrelated local taxes are, and then you have sales tax, when you account for all of that in Connecticut, there have been a number of studies that have shown that our tax rate, the percentage of total income including capital gains and everything else that people pay in Connecticut, it's essentially a flat tax rate when you take into account property taxes, sales tax, and everything else. Essentially a flat tax until you get to the very, very wealthiest 1% of Connecticut residents, and then it just drops through the floor. They pay about half the effective tax rate that everyone else pays. And so we're at a point where it's not about asking the wealthiest residents of Connecticut to pay more. We're simply asking them to pay their fair share. If they paid their fair share, really our revenue problems would go away just like that.
Well, I think there's a lot of difficulties, and first I wanted to take a minute to address the tolls, because I know I went to a Republican constituent meeting recently, and I said, well, okay. They asked me what my opinions were on things, and I was like, well, everybody was complaining, $3 for tires, another 7 cents on for gas tax, and they were making points about, well, it affects local drivers, and talking about tolling and everything else. And I said, well, what's your solution?
Right.
And they said, well, they pointed me to a study or a proposal they put forth 3 years ago, where they wanted to bond a lot of this, and we're talking to the tune of somewhere between $400 and $500 million a year. The problem with that is the last budget cycle through, they put a bond cap in, and for
Right.
people who don't know, what bonding funds, they're paying on the credit card, but they're supposed to be going for, a lot of times they go for the general good of the public. So it might be for things specifically in your town, might be for economic development, all of these things. So what essentially that would do is that would cut that down by 25% at least, where that would automatically be bonded out. Me personally, I feel like, okay, you should pay as you go.
Yeah.
Why are we pushing this off to the future? The future is now. The reality is, when our federal highway system was built in the 50s and the 60s, we had tolls, and those tolls, in my thought place, we're paying back for all the things. And once they were done, they were supposed to be paying for the next line of work
Right.
that needed to get done. And I have been through some of these new tolls. I went over the Tappan Zee Bridge, and you're right, traffic doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Takes a picture of your plate. And I do think that we aren't capturing a lot of those dollars that come in. But as you say, technology is moving ahead, so that's going to help. But I do think there are a lot of these projects that really need to get done, and they are the future of where we're going.
That's right. I mean, you have to look at so many of these infrastructure projects as investments, and unlike, talking about bonding and really then you're just pushing things off again on another generation yet again. Whereas investing in infrastructure is going to have, a huge impact long term on our economy. And I think we're at the point right now where if we start focusing on it now, it could have just an amazing impact on our state. Infrastructure also, just from a safety perspective, is something that just has to happen, right? I mean, our bridges are in disrepair right now, a big percentage of them. And so the good news is, since it's something we have to do anyway, and since our economy is struggling, those kinds of investments are fantastic for the economy. Those dollars are staying here. People who get those checks are going to go out and spend them in their community. And it has this rippling effect throughout the whole economy. But we also need to look beyond just simply maintaining and repairing our current infrastructure. Things are changing in the way people want to move and get around. We were talking earlier about, I had a volunteer for the campaign that I met with the other day from Quinnipiac Law School, and I met with him at a coffee shop, in New Haven without even thinking about it. That's where I said, hey, let's meet. And he came out there, and in the course of our conversation, I found out that he had to take an Uber to get there because he's from New York and he doesn't drive by choice. And I obviously would have chosen a different location if I had known that. But the point is that in terms of public transportation, you just simply couldn't get there from here, kind of thing. And there's a lot of places in Connecticut like that. I attended Senator Chris Murphy's Transportation Summit at the University of Bridgeport a few weeks ago. And there was a gentleman deals with development in New Haven that gave this startling statistic to me, that if you look in the New Haven area, and I think it probably holds true around the state and many other parts, 2/3 of the jobs that people need, it would take 90 minutes or more to get to those jobs by bus. So given that we have a younger population, at least one of my children has said that they don't want to even learn how to drive. Very different from our generation.
That's a scary thought. Yeah,
Right.
I couldn't wait to get my license.
It meant freedom, but
Yeah.
there's different sentiment out there with it today, and you see more and more young kids who just are getting their licenses later or choosing not to get them at all. And cars are just an incredible added expense for young people when they're just starting out. So having a good public transportation system, bus shelters that are functional, look nice, that you want to go to. I've been to recently, last summer, I went to a place that had these. So my brother lives in England, and we went to visit him, and we didn't rent a car, and it was easy to get around by bus. And you go into the bus shelter. It was a nice shelter, and it had this digital display telling you exactly when your bus is arriving to the minute. And sure enough, 1 minute and there's the bus coming around the corner. And it was just that little extra difference of making sure, it's not that you need all new buses or anything like that, simply making sure that it's convenient to use, that it's reliable, and you're going to get just a whole new level of ridership on there. It's essentially like the Field of Dreams, right? You build it and they will come. You have to set it up first, and then people will use it. If we have talking about this student that I had met with, this is his first view of Connecticut, and he can't get anywhere, unless he pays Uber to take him there. And we have one of the things that we unquestionably do well in Connecticut are all our fantastic universities and colleges, and you get people from really all around the world and all around the country coming here, and it's a missed opportunity for us to make this first impression on these people that we want to settle in our state. So if they came here and it is as it is now, or let's look at the alternative, they're able to get anywhere on good, reliable public transportation. And we have another thing that I think we need, and a lot of people have been talking about, is finding ways to bring broadband. There's a lot of different proposals on how to do that, but finding ways to bring broadband throughout the state. And if they had access to cheap, high-speed internet, and good public transportation, and our roads and bridges were in good repair, then this would be a very attractive place when they are starting their own small businesses. And they might say, this might be a place I want to come.
Well, I think one of the things I know they invested in was the New Haven line up to Springfield. And a lot of, when you go over to Europe, it's all trains.
Yeah.
And you can get anywhere by train. I think those are good things that we need to continue to invest in. I think obviously some of this money comes from a federal basis, but it also comes from having a plan on how to put this together. And the reason I say that, along the shoreline, I know going out past, when you get past New Haven, there's a lot of complaints about where Amtrak was thinking of putting their line through. So I think there has to be a level of coordination that comes with when you're dealing with the federal government and trying to plan out these things. So, and you're never going to please everybody,
Right.
but you know what? You have to start in a certain direction. And I know some people have fought different ideas that they've come up with, but I think we have to come up with an overall structure or an overall plan of how to get there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right now we don't have a plan. That's the
No.
that's the biggest problem. We're just kind of floundering. We need a direction. And it's true that even if tomorrow we approved big infrastructure plans for Connecticut, a lot of that is going to be reliant on some federal dollars, and those federal dollars are not coming right now. But they will. Eventually they will. They always do. Typically, when it comes to infrastructure projects, you have an 80-20 split with the feds. So 80% federal government kicks in, and they want to make sure the states have some skin in the game, and so which makes sense. And so the state kicks in 20%. So, but what actually just came out of the proposed infrastructure plan actually just flipped that upside down and basically did the exact opposite, where the states would have to pay 80%. So I don't think unless there's like something that had to be done right now, I don't think you're going to find the state biting on that one immediately.
I think the Pearl Harbor Bridge, which replaced the Q Bridge,
Right.
I think that was even at a higher rate. I think that was like close to like 90%. Because of the importance of, and it wasn't just the bridge itself, it was widening those 8 miles, north and south of the bridge that made the big difference. But much like that, I mean, I think of the safety factors that go in. Instead of having a left-hand turn and people going in 50 directions, there's more uniformity. Up just above where your district is the Mix Master.
Yes, scary.
Kind of reminds me, it's like a cocktail party. Yeah, we're going to shake this up.
Yeah.
But those are big interchanges. Route 8, Route 84, those are the ones that trucks go through, and safety is a big concern. I know they've been working on choke points.
Yeah.
That go within that. But I mean, those are the kind of things that we need to look at, is how do we stop like the choke points and get traffic moving. But as you said, how do we, I never see something up on the highway. I travel 95 all the time, and you're talking about how do I get from this town to like this town. I've never seen buses go up on the highway.
Right, you're right.
I see them, and they're traveling down. So there's
Towards Hartford, you see them sometimes, but
there's
95.
no like express like on 95 going down. They're all down Route 1 because they're all planned in that capacity. Take it for granted we have the railway
Right.
that goes through, but I think all those things are important. Just as I think making sure that the Waterbury line runs efficiently, and
I mean, it's interesting. So if you look from where the train runs from Bridgeport out through Waterbury and beyond, if you look at some of the old train stations, so you see that it's funny because we're kind of almost coming full circle, right? So
Yeah.
I grew up in the Valley, and grew up in Beacon Falls, but family originally came from Ansonia and Derby, and if you look at the train station in Derby, and if you look at the one in Naugatuck, they're not used for that purpose anymore. Beautiful train stations, you look at them, and very nice. And there was a commitment to rail at the time, and a lot of people used it. Now, like the one in Naugatuck, there's the former train station is converted to a very nice restaurant, and then adjacent to it is the shelter for the train that looks very much like one of the bus shelters
stops.
that we
Yeah.
have, and that's where we're at right now. It's not, it doesn't run as often as it should, and it's just not as reliable as it should be. But we have, but at least we have the line there, so we have a starting place, and there are things that we can do there for sure.
Well, like you said, it's investment, and it also in the bigger picture of things, it benefits development in our larger cities because you have a feeder system for if companies organize themselves in larger communities. Similarly, it allows people in smaller communities or smaller startups to be able to distance themselves and put themselves outside of a city, but still be able to have that quick connection to like get down there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
For,
You know, it was interesting, you know, so in fact, we used to have a great light rail system like the trolleys, right, in Connecticut. If you look, you know, when I was growing up in Naugatuck and Derby, you'd actually see when the tar would wear away, you see the old, I think they've mostly been ripped up now, but you used to see the old rail lines from where the trolley was, and you used to go right down, you know, Chapel Street in Haven and all that, and so, you know, we fell in love with the automobile, but I think to some extent we're falling out of love with it now. You know, one of the, actually is another stat from the Transportation Summit that Chris Murphy was talking about, that there was some poll showing that about the least, the thing that people like the least in life, almost in life as far as daily things, is sitting in traffic. And anyone, you know, you could relate to that. I would rather spend an extra half hour on a train, frankly, than be in stop and go traffic on 95. And so, and you can only widen these lanes so far. How far are we going to go? Just turn the whole state into a highway, you know? So at some point we need to start thinking again about public transportation.
It's a big to do. Now we were talking about heading back around again to our economy and where things are really changing around. And I know one of the things that we're looking at is as you were telling me, it used to be Ansonia Steel and the brass companies that were the major drivers of our economy here in the valley. Or as they call it, the Great American Valley, because
that's right.
Where do you think that the investment should be now, or how do we help create that kind of investment in? Is it a large business coming in here, or is it?
Right. So you know, look, we would certainly always welcome large businesses if they want to come to our state. They're welcome to come to our state. But the idea of, you saw the clamoring for the second Amazon headquarters, and everyone just, you know, putting out the red carpet and literally offering them anything they wanted, you know, if they would come to their town. I don't think that's the way to go. Yeah, I mean, so my great-grandfather, he worked his entire career at, we were trying to remember the names of it, but it was Ansonia Steel, and across the street basically was American Brass. And between the two of those companies alone, in that area, thousands and thousands of, tens of thousands of people were employed between those two companies during their heyday.
Uniroyal was another one.
Uniroyal, yeah, if you go down, Naugatuck, and there was also, in fact, they made Naugahyde, was a thing made in the valley as well, like a fake leather.
Yeah, I remember.
And so we used to joke about the wild Naugahydes running around. But so if basically at that time, if you didn't work in one of those big, large companies, your neighbor did, and the entire economy was benefited from it, but also was dependent on it, you know. And so if they chose to pick up and leave, and these days companies seem more mobile than ever. They seem like if they have a better deal someplace else, they're just going to leave. And so the idea that we can count on a company coming and staying for a century, I think, is gone. That time is gone. So we need to look at, in fact, American Brass still exists in Ansonia, but instead of employing thousands, it's high-tech manufacturing, employs like 100 people now. And that's really where the trend is going. So we need to make sure that if we have broadband, if we have the right infrastructure, and we're attracting these kinds of companies that are really the future, 21st century jobs, we also have to make sure that we have a workforce that's trained for that. So vocational training is something that we need to reinvest in our state, and community colleges, as well as apprenticeships. In our state could actually play a big role along with our vocational colleges of partnering with labor unions on apprenticeship programs to make sure that when these startup companies or companies move in, high-tech companies come into Connecticut, that we have the kinds of employees that they need to fill those ranks. So that's an area I think we need to focus on.
And I know along with that, certainly a friend of mine who was up in the House a few years ago, he introduced an idea that languages, along with obviously they teach French, Spanish as foreign languages, that they should teach coding.
Yes.
As a language, because ultimately those are the kind of people that you're going to need, and you need them in order to be able to do some of these startups. So I know one of the big things we push is similarly vocational trades, tool and die makers. I know it seems like they're a dying art. If you go into some of these manufacturing companies, these guys are like the lifeblood. They're the ones who make the tools in order to for these machines to run.
Right.
They earn upwards of way over $100,000 if you're you're high quality, and it's an art.
That's right.
It's not just I mean, people think of manufacturing, they don't think it's literally an art in order to be able to develop and do a lot of these things. And same thing with if you want to use some of the high tech manufacturing, you have to know how to be able to use a computer. You have to be able to, use the skills in order to be able to do these sort of things.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And also because while you're building out this infrastructure to support these kinds of jobs, what you need are the building trades, which the timeless trades. You need the timeless trades to prepare us for the 21st century jobs. My grandfather used to always tell me and my brother that we should be plumbers, and we should have listened. It's not all about 4-year degrees. These trades pay a good wage. They people can make a good living in those, and our economy needs it. They're an integral part of it.
I know I was fortunate. Part of when I was growing up, part of high school and college years, I did all kinds of different trades. I worked doing carpentry, remodeling, so I learned my basics of electricians, plumbing, some framing. I did stone masonry.
Save some money around the house.
I do all the stuff on my house, like all the time.
I do it too, but it doesn't look very good.
It makes my life a lot easier. It's not perfect. I'm like one of those 90 to 95 percenters. I'll get 95% of it looking right, and that
I'm
extra
good.
5.
I'm good when I finish a job.
Yeah.
But then I won't need it again for another 20 years, unfortunately. And so.
Yeah, I know. It takes that amount of time in order to be able to get it perfected. Now, I know we kind of covered a lot of the economic, and I think economics are obviously highly important, and they're going to be big determiners in our next election. But more than economics, I think sometimes it's shared values.
Sure.
And shared values really go a long way to how we really treat each other and what we think are important. And I know number one on my list, and I know it's probably number one on your list, because I have a son with a rare genetic disease.
Yeah.
And I pay for my own health care, and I get hammered, literally, being on the exchange. Healthcare is an important thing that we all have to deal with, and I look at healthcare. Healthcare is a right.
Yes.
And it's something that we need to figure out a way to do better.
Absolutely. We've had a conversation about that. My son, and by the way, I always, whenever I talk about my son, I make sure I get permission.
Mm-hmm.
He's 14. He'll be 15 next month, and so before I talk about him publicly, I make sure is this okay, and he's very open, and he was fine. So He has a kidney condition, childhood nephrotic syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a rare disease. And so yesterday we spent the day in the infusion lab over at Yale and in Children's Hospital all day because there's a risk of a reaction. So they put it in very slowly. So we're there when it opens and we're there when it closes. And but actually, great crew over there, and it was actually a pleasant experience. Got to hang out all day, so we sort of look forward to it in an odd way. But I can only imagine. I'm fortunate. I have very good health insurance. Many people I know do not. And if you're like yourself and you're getting it off the exchange because your income level is high enough and maybe you're not getting any subsidies from that exchange, maybe technically you can do it, but it's a huge impact on your budget. And if you're a millionaire, that's one thing, no big deal. But for most people, if your household makes 75,000 or if it makes 150,000, you have a whole lot more in common than others.
My insurance payment is more than my mortgage payment is.
Amazing,
Yeah.
and so we've been looking, and I think if you go back several years, we were focused on the feds and see what can they do at the federal level to deal with this problem that is universal. I mean, just about everyone looks at that and either they can't afford insurance or it's just putting them right up against the wall and they have a tough time making ends meet if they're, or the insurance is just substandard. And and imagine with our children having to be forced to make a decision where we simply cannot afford this treatment. And there are many families that are, depending on what it is, where they actually simply cannot afford a procedure, and there isn't necessarily an avenue for them to get that done. So I don't think anyone imagines that this is going to be fixed at the federal level anytime soon. We could be hopeful, and maybe 5 years out from now we'll have something again, another chance. I think we missed a real opportunity, frankly. After in 2009, 2010, I think we missed a real opportunity. We should have had a public option. We could have done other things. I'm one that ideally I wish. I think I've come to the kind of conclusion that long term we have to move towards single payer. That's not going to happen in Connecticut right now, but long term, I think that's where we need to go.
I think there are different versions of it. I know I've spoken to somebody who's deeply knowledgeable, who I can't mention who his name is, has told me straight out, Medicare for all, or having catastrophic health care is something that they could probably have done already. And then that would leave, if you take that whole section of things off of the table, that would leave you purchasing health insurance for a lot of the, day-to-day sort of things, and in order to be able to deal with that. And that would help everybody across the board, and that's what my hope is at some time in my lifetime.
We pay more, we pay more in America for worse outcomes.
Yes.
And we don't allow negotiation, for Medicare, Medicaid, we don't allow negotiation. And so I think, ultimately that's where I would like to see it. But that doesn't mean we just sit here on our hands for the next decade and hope that something happens. There are a lot of things we can do here in Connecticut. We could have potentially a public option right here in Connecticut, and it doesn't have to cost the state money. It's about, a risk pool, So it's about setting it up, and so I think that's something that we need to address.
That's a big thing on my list, and I know. Obviously, another big part of that is Medicaid. A lot of the programs that I work on are sponsored in Medicaid. I know I had my fights out with this last administration or current administration a number of years ago to get them to understand the needs of the program. But I think that goes along with listening to your constituents,
Yes.
and that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. And that's one of those issues that when you talk to people, that is just so universal, that people struggle with that. They struggle with a secure retirement. You don't have the defined benefit plans that's kind of rare these days, particularly in the private sector. And so that's something that needs to be addressed. Right now, people kind of have their heads in the sand a little bit, myself included, that somehow it's going to miraculously take care of itself. But the common joke among a lot of people I know is, basically that retirement's not going to happen, that retire. How is that even possible? And so that's something that we need to figure out too, is how to make sure that you play by the rules, you're working 40 years, that you should be able to have a secure retirement. There are a lot of and basically making sure that your children right now, the other ballooning cost that everyone is dealing with, all families are dealing with, is higher education. And how do we get that under control? And if there's a lot of plans out there, there was one in, I believe, Oregon, where it was Washington or Oregon, where it's called Pay It Forward, and basically after you graduate, you pay a certain percentage of your income back, over for a certain period of time, 15 years, 20 years, whatever it is, and then you're done. So it's always affordable. And then there are other ways of doing it, like the way New York is looking at now, where you graduate from a state college or university, and if you work in the state for a period of time, that the loans get forgiven, and you could look at that again, just like talk about infrastructure. You could look at that as an investment. They're living in the state, they're paying taxes in the state, buying things in the state, and so they're helping our overall economy.
I think people often don't realize that taxes are also a way to engineer or deal with some of the economic realities of what you're facing. So, how do you make it so that people want to stay in the state? Well, you have to pay taxes in order to provide the infrastructure that continues to bring people in, but you also have to incentivize for people to stay in the state.
Right.
And without it being sort of like what I call like a retribution.
That's right. That's right. It is a fine, and that was my one concern
Yeah.
about, you don't want to get into a situation where they feel like they just can't move. I mean, we don't want to hold people here. We want them to want to live here. That's for my children growing up. I have 3 teenagers, triplets, and for them.
And you have no real gray hair over there.
I definitely have some gray, yeah. A lot more than I started, losing a little up top, but yeah. They'll all be 15 next month, and they're at Hamden High School. Go Dragons! And nothing would make me happier for them to settle and raise their own families right here in Connecticut, where it's an easy drive to their home or easy drive to our home. But I don't want them to have to stay here. I want it to be a choice because there are great jobs here and it's a great place to live.
And I've lived here for the last 40 plus years. I grew up here. This is where I'm staying. My wife wants to live here. This is where she's staying. As things change, we find a way to remain in the same area, because I couldn't imagine being any other place than here with all the different things that we have along those lines. But I know you and I both share the same thing as far as having kids in the system, and I did want to get back around to this.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Was talking about what happened in Florida And in our communities, obviously, Sandy Hook, and I know a few weeks ago, I had Marin Sanchez's mom. She's somebody whose daughter was stalked and murdered in my city school system. And I know one of the big things that I look at within this is quite often we blame, as I call them, like the lone wolf or the one person, and we all say that it's a mental health thing. And I give legislators a lot of credit after Sandy Hook for putting forth some of the gun control efforts. I don't know, I might not get a lot of like people that like me for this stuff, but this is reality. Is, you know what? I see no reason for anybody to own an AR-15. It's an assault weapon. It's meant to kill people. You're not going hunting with it. I don't see any reason to have bump stocks in guns, because there's no reason why you have to have like 50 rounds that can be able to go off all at once. You know, we talk about school safety and how do we keep our communities safe, and I hear people coming out with these ideas like, well, why don't we arm like our teachers? And I'm like, what are you saying to the kids around you that, you know, and I know I put this in a post this morning, you know, even in the wild, wild west, they checked your guns at the city limits.
That's right. Yeah. And yeah, you know, it's when, you know, the latest shooting happens, it's so easy to get numb. You know, you don't even want to watch it. You know, with kids in the school, and I think even if you don't have kids in the school, it's, you know, hard to watch that coverage and not get choked up. And in Connecticut, we have, you talked about it being a controversial position somehow to be opposed to civilians having access to assault weapons. I don't think it's actually that controversial at all. It makes it seem as if it's controversial because there are some people that are yelling very loudly. Mm-hmm. But when you look at polls, people do not want those weapons in civilian hands. Most of the reforms that we enacted in Connecticut after Sandy Hook are actually quite popular, and even across the partisan line, they're popular. If you look at universal background checks, which a lot of people kind of erroneously think that we have in the country, we don't. We don't. We have, you know, we have so many loopholes. You could drive a truck through it. Mm-hmm. Private gun sales, gun shows, and also if the background check takes a little too long to go through, then they have to push it through and give you access to the gun just because it passed some arbitrary time limit to go through. And if you don't fund that part of it, then it means that tons of guns are going into the hands of people that we know should not have them. That's not a controversial position, even among NRA members. And if you look at the leadership of the NRA, they seem to basically just be a wing of the gun lobby, rather than representing sportsmen, which is where the NRA started from. I have many friends who hunt. Mm-hmm. In the Boy Scouts, I enjoyed shooting, going to the rifle range and shooting a .22, and I think
the point is you were shooting a .22,
yes,
which is a small caliber gun. As I like
single
to say,
loaded, by the way, one at a time.
As I like to say, I'm not going quail hunting with Dick Cheney if he's holding an AR-15.
Yes, and I don't think I would, no matter what he was holding.
No, it might be dangerous for your health right there. But I think that is the reality. You know what? I don't think that we have to be able to talk to each other.
That's right.
And there has to be some sensibility, and I know this is more of a national discussion than of other people, and they have different ways of life, and they grow up with guns, but they don't grow up with machine guns.
No.
And that's where I like to differentiate this whole topic of gun control, and that there is sensibility. There was sensibility on the Republican side after James Brady got shot, had a brain injury. He was right there next to Reagan, and he advocated for these things, and we got a bill passed like in the 90s. But somewhere somehow that sensibility has all fallen apart. Why a year ago our and I can't even say a president, 45, would take away background checks for mentally ill, and allow them access to guns and everything else. And I'm not going to demonize people who are mentally ill. There are, let's face it, there are 1 in 10 of us that have mental health conditions, and for the large part, mental health, it's more of an inward thing. They're not like outward. There are some other issues going on, but we as a community need to find better ways in order to be able to help these people and help identify them. And I think more and more as we go on from here, helping to understand that a lot of times these are like very withdrawn people, and a lot of times the ones that aren't engaged. And I know my son, his good friend that he goes to school with has some issues to deal with. And you know what? He was the first one to go up to him, and he wanted him as his friend. And they said, "You're going to be like my best friend." And he was like, I knew he didn't have any other friends at the time. That's my son. That's the way that he engages people. But I think at a younger age that's something that we need to help foster and help people understand, but also realize that people have mental health issues and other things, but we can't give them access to weapons on top of it.
No, and the way the discussion goes is it's either or, right? That somehow we're talking about the mental health issue, or we're talking about being a gun grabber, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. We can have a common sense discussion, right? We don't have to all retreat to our corners. And so, like talking about friending kids that are a bit isolated for whatever reason. I wish I remembered the name of it, but Sandy Hook Promise has a program that they're trying to put into high schools and different schools around the state. It might be Just Say Hi or something like that. But the basic idea of that is about outreach to reduce that kind of isolation. And and I think that is a wonderful part of the puzzle. And then fixing our broken healthcare system that we were talking about, making sure that everyone has access to treatment for mental health, not just physical. And that's another piece to the puzzle. And then obviously another piece to the puzzle is access to high capacity weapons. If you need a high capacity rifle to take down a deer, you should spend a little bit more time at the range first. You don't need that. And so
I got a lot more respect for you if you can hit him with a bow and arrow than if you can, you can spray him with an AR-15.
Yeah. Actually, in scout camp, I worked at the archery range. Enjoyed that quite a bit. But yeah, exactly. Because that's really what it comes down to. And so in Connecticut, after we enacted these rules, these reforms, there has been a 40% reduction in gun deaths. And so, yes, in people will kind of, if you point to any particular reform, they will say yes, but then they can just do this. That's true, but it's not about eliminating risk. It's about reducing risk. And that's what we did in Connecticut. And sportsmen still have access to weapons, people who need weapons for self-defense. I'm not a gun owner myself, but people who feel that they need that still have access. But we just set up a few extra precautions to try to reduce the risk that the wrong people
as
are
I'd like to
getting
say,
access.
harm reduction. I know
Yes.
55 minutes goes on so fast.
Oh, okay.
So I'll give you the last minute, obviously, to talk to your potential voters coming out here and give them the reason why they should come out and vote for you.
Well, first, thank you for having me on here.
Of
This
course.
is great. I was watching your programs last year when you had Justin and Brad on, and I was helping on their campaigns because it's a team effort. And this year they're helping on my campaigns, and so I'm looking forward to coming out and knocking on the doors of every voter in this district and finding out what they need from me to do in Hartford and to start that conversation.
As I like to say, Sean Grace, coming to a door near you. Sean, it was a pleasure to have
Thank
you
you.
on here, and thank you for being part of our Street Talk family. And with that, we can run the street.